So my name is Charmaine Williams. I am a professor and interim dean at the Factor-Inwentash Faculty of Social Work, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural Janis Rotman Distinguished Lecture on Mental Wellness. To start off this evening's proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which we are gathered and on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to learn, teach, and work on this land. Whenever I do a land acknowledgement, I feel it's important to reflect on how taking that moment to show respect to the people who were here before us influences and perhaps even changes what's going to happen next. This evening, and particularly in light of the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation that took place September 30th, I am thinking about how, as a social work community and as a community with a shared goal for social justice, we must work to better address, acknowledge, and understand the historical and generational trauma that has affected and continues to affect Indigenous people and communities on this land. And it is so fitting that we are gathering this evening to expand our knowledge and awareness of the traumas associated with racism, as we are in times when these traumas surround us. Our awareness of the mental health consequences of contemporary and collective racial trauma and the layers added by historical and multi-generational trauma is crucial in this moment. I'm so glad that we're able to have this evening with Dr. Monnica Williams, and the response to this evening's lecture suggests that we are in a room full of people who share the belief that these issues are ones that we need to know better. As you will have seen in our program and our promotional materials, tonight's event is the inaugural Janis Rotman Distinguished Lecture on Mental Wellness. This new annual lecture series was inspired by Janis Rotman, a generous and ardent supporter of our faculty, whose philanthropic vision led to the establishment of the faculty's Talk It Out clinic. And this clinic was launched during the height of the pandemic. It was established to serve Black and lower income communities hardest hit by COVID-19, as well as seniors and young adults living with chronic illness. Janice's commitment to these issues is inspirational, and her lead gift inspired many others who you will see mentioned in your program. To everyone who has supported the Talk It Out Counseling Clinic, I would like to extend a heartfelt thank you for your generosity and for your recognition of the essential role that mental health services plays in helping individuals and communities recover from the multiple crises heightened during the pandemic. Janis Rotman could not be here tonight, but if she were, I know she would have been honored to welcome you, and she would have been pleased by the enthusiastic reception for this lecture. I would like to express my deep gratitude to her for creating this lecture series that will bring us together to discuss the very important topic of mental wellness in our communities. If she was here, I would want to take a moment for us all to express our appreciation for her generosity and her vision, and I hope you won't mind doing this for her in absentia. Thank you so much, Janis Rotman. It is now my pleasure to introduce our featured speaker. The annual Janis Rotman Distinguished Lecture on Mental Wellness is a keynote address by a leading researcher, practitioner, or educator that provides insight into topics such as innovations in culturally attuned mental health services, social work's role in addressing widening mental health disparities, the impact of community-based care, and other contemporary concerns at the intersections of social work and mental health. We are delighted to have Dr. Monnica Williams as our keynote speaker for the inaugural Distinguished Lecture. Dr. Monnica Williams is a board-certified licensed clinical psychologist specializing in cognitive behavioral therapies and an associate professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Ottawa. She is also a Canada Research Chair in Mental Health Disparities. It just occurred to me this might all be behind me. and the director of the Laboratory for Culture and Mental Health Disparities and the clinical director of the Behavior Wellness Clinic in Tolland, Connecticut. Dr. Williams has also founded clinics in Kentucky, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. Dr. Williams has published over 100 peer-reviewed articles, as well as many book chapters and scientific reports. Her scholarly work focuses on anxiety-related conditions, mental health disparities, cultural competence, and therapeutic best practices. Dr. Williams contributes frequently to the public scientific discourse as a media expert. Her impressive body of work has led to her being named one of the top 25 thought leaders in PTSD and one of the 16 most influential women shaping the future of psychedelics. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Williams to the podium.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here today. I'm going to have a little... And let me see if this works the way it's supposed to. Great. So yes, I'm here to talk about racial trauma and how racism can cause PTSD. And I think for those of you who may identify as people of color, as Black people like myself, it's probably not really a mystery that racism can cause trauma. But for people who maybe have not experienced racism or haven't experienced much racism, this might be a new idea. So I'm going to walk you through this. I don't need to really go over my bio since I got such a wonderful introduction. But I will say that I wear a lot of hats. I really think of myself primarily as a researcher. That's what I love doing. And I also love teaching people and helping people understand things that maybe they hadn't thought about before. Now, I do like to give a few little warnings. This presentation may make you uncomfortable because it's going to include a conversation about race, racism, and trauma. All of these are sensitive, hot-button issues. We are also socialized not to talk about many of these things. And so as a result of being socialized not to talk about, say, race, people aren't good at it. And so they may be reluctant to engage with material like this out of fear of being perceived as a racist. We're going to talk about all of this anyway. I am a behaviorist. I treat anxiety conditions. So, one of my mottos is sort of like embrace your fear, embrace your anxiety, like run into the fire, right? So that's what we're going to do. And you may be upset by some of the things we're going to talk about, some of the images that I might share, and if so, that is totally normal and healthy. And actually, I find it a bit odd, people who aren't disturbed by racism, and I think that that's something we also need to study because racism is disturbing. Now, in a society that privileges whiteness and white people, racist ideas are considered normal, and we see them throughout our media, our culture, our social systems, and our institutions. So Angela Davis here says, in a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. So that means it's not good enough to say, oh, well, I'm not going to mistreat anybody, and I'm not going to discriminate, so I'm good, right? No, that's not good, because we know that without actually putting forth any effort, racism is being enacted. And so to create an equal society, we have to commit not only to making unbiased choices, but also to combating racism when we see it. And we have to commit to being anti-racist in all aspects of our lives. And so being anti-racist means fighting for fairness, which is fighting against racism. Now, for those of you who are clinicians, often we put forward the goal that clinicians should be culturally competent. Cultural competence is a process, and it can be hard to keep up. There are several stages in the growth process, And one reason this is hard is because things are changing all the time. Attitudes are changing. Diversity used to be something you tolerate, now it's a positive value. Racial groups are changing. Who goes into which groups? By the way, newsflash, this is not about biology. These are social decisions, right? Stats Canada decides who's in what group. Laws are changing. Discrimination used to be legal. Now it's not, at least not if it's obvious. The language is changing. What terms do we use? How do we talk about people in different groups? Is it people of color? Is it BIPOC? Is it colored people? Maybe not colored people anymore, right? So language is constantly changing. How do we keep up? Racism is changing. It used to be more overt. Now it's more covert. Doesn't mean it went away, though. It's still there. So for this reason, we have to be humble. We have to exhibit cultural humility, because cultural competence is something that we are striving toward. We never achieve it. We just keep working toward it. So it's an ongoing process. Now, there are many important ways people can be diverse. Often when I give these talks, somebody will say, hey, you didn't include my group, or what about that group over there? And I want to say all of these different groups, all of these different identities, they're all important. Recognition and appreciation of diverse identities has tended to focus on categories such as race, ethnicity, culture, gender, sex, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, age, disability, religion. These have been called the Big Eight, and they were named by the National Association of Independent Schools in the States as part of a discussion about equity, equality, and diversity. And within each of these identities, there comes a certain amount of stigma or privilege depending on how you identify, right? So stigmatized identities are those which are likely to be met with disfavor and ostracization, whereas privileged identities garner favor and respect. So discrimination on the basis of these identities is unfortunately common. Almost all of these identities, we would say that they're, that they're ascribed and not acquired, meaning that people have very little control over, at an individual level, which of these identities they possess. Although some amount of change is possible, for the most part, people are born with or socialized into these identities, and so no one should be stigmatized or privileged on the basis of these identities alone. Race and ethnicity are among the most highly stigmatized identities in our culture. And they're also, interestingly, very powerful determinants of many basic attributes, such as where you will live, where you will go to school, how much money you will make, who you will marry, and if you will become incarcerated. So our culture places a high value on being non-discriminatory. However, we know that people do react to each other based on their presumed racial and ethnic identity. Now, certainly, again, these are not the only ways people can be diverse. There's been a move away from emphasizing the Big Eight. There are other important identifiers too, such as family origin, family structure, geographic regional background, nationality, language, appearance and body image, learning styles and behavior, academic, social achievement, and beliefs, be they political, social, or religious. However, our focus today is going to be on race and ethnicity. Also, I will use a lot of Black examples, but these may apply to other racialized or otherwise marginalized groups as well, or they may not. All this to say, our country is actually very diverse, and this is one of its strengths. When I talk about people of color in Canada, I'm combining groups that have been termed visible minorities and Indigenous people. So this figure represents the proportion of people of color in the Canadian population and future projections based on data from Statistics Canada. As a nation, we're a third people of color, and this is climbing, right? So this is an important issue, and it's going to become increasingly important as our nation becomes more diverse. And so in order to understand racial trauma, we have to define racism. what is racism? And when we think about racism, most of us think about people doing very overt and blatant acts of racism. And certainly that is a problem that happens. We call that dominative racism or old-fashioned racism. But there are other forms of racism as well. People tend to think about racism in terms of, well, did the person intend to be racist, right? But bad intent is almost always denied. It does not really help to look at the intention. One has to look at the consequences. One does not have to have negative intent in order to perpetrate racism. Overt feelings of hate and prejudice are not needed to perpetrate racism. Racism is often hidden, subtle, and covert. So other forms of racism include what we might call symbolic or modern racism. And these are people who may embrace negative stereotypes about different cultural groups. They may feel that certain cultures are morally inferior because of their practices. Sometimes we refer to this as right-wing racism. Aversive racism, on the other hand, these are people who support racial equality outwardly, but internally have conflicted negative feelings about people of color. And so when nobody's looking, they actually act just like the other kinds of racists. This may be unconscious. We sometimes call this left-wing racism. Racism on both sides of the aisles, ladies and gentlemen. And also, we look at overt versus covert racism. And one form of covert racism is microaggressions. These are small acts. We're going to talk a little bit more about them. That small acts in comparison to maybe more overt acts like lynching. Okay. And they can include patronizing statements and backhanded compliments. And then we also have internalized racism. And this is the racism that people of color may feel about themselves or about people in their own group or about people in other racialized groups, right? And so people of color can also have racism. They can also work to uphold white supremacy, rather. Systemic racism is not listed here because, by definition, all racism is systemic. Here's what I mean by that. We have lots of racism that is baked into our structures, right? So racism is a system of beliefs or racial prejudices, practices, such as racial discrimination, and policies, structural racism based on race that operate to advantage those with historical power, which is white people in most Western nations. In Canada, race operates as a caste system, and it groups people based on shared physical features, and it's ever evolving. It's a social construct with no biological basis, and it stems from white supremacy. This, again, is the ideology that presumes the superiority of white people and inferiority of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. The roots of racism can be traced back to imperialism, goes back hundreds of years, colonialism, and the transatlantic slave trade. And here we see a few examples of structural racism. For example, legacy programs that grant preferential college admissions to children of alumni, if, given that maybe 50 years ago, people of color couldn't go to those colleges, right? Institutional racism, this would be, for example, the overrepresentation of BIPOC youth in under-resourced schools, so that stands for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Or it could be environmental racism, for example, unsafe drinking water on Indigenous reserves, but not in primarily white communities, right? So these are some ways that racism is baked into things. Now, in our culture, we tend to have a divided perspective when it comes to racism. White people tend to believe that different racial groups are doing well in life, that racism is no longer a problem, and discrimination is declining, and that they are not capable of racist behaviors. People in racialized groups, on the other hand, are confronted with daily acts of racism, and so they have a very different racial reality. they may experience racism from those very people that think they're not capable of it. White people tend to limit their definition of racism to blatant, intentional, overt acts. But as I pointed out, few people who commit racist acts will ever admit to intentionally wanting to harm others, especially due to race. And so under this definition, few acts of racism would be defined as such. But the fact of the matter is, even good people enact racism, and often racism is overlooked by those who don't experience it. So here's an example of the reality of racism. I'm going to use my own country as an example. We'll throw the USA under the bus and look at the difference between black and white Americans, right? And as we can see, just about every economic, social, educational indicator, there are stark differences between the life realities of black people and white people in America. And this is a scientific fact. This is not an opinion, okay? So it's notable that a typical black household has accumulated less than 1/10 of the wealth of a typical white one. And we also see gaps in who's graduating from university, with actually black and Hispanic people falling further behind. But this is not just an American problem. Here is an example of systemic racism in Canada, where some have argued that the conditions under which Indigenous people endure in Canada are even worse than the conditions experienced by Black Americans. For example, if you are Indigenous in Canada, you may have unsafe drinking water in your community for decades. If you're kidnapped and female, law enforcement will not look for you. If you leave your community to go to university, you may lose your Indigenous status and scholarships. If you seek mental health care, you're much more likely to have a bad experience compared to everyone else, even other people of color. In fact, we did a research study, and half of the Indigenous people who responded in this nationwide survey said that they had already had bad experiences with mental health care, and that was a barrier for them. And it's nearly impossible to find an Indigenous practicing psychologist. One report said that there's probably less than 12 practicing Indigenous psychologists in the whole country. If you have a baby in a hospital, you may be sterilized against your will. And in fact, there's a class action suit in Saskatchewan where 100 women have already come forward. If you have to go to the hospital for any reason at all, you may be verbally abused by medical staff, and you may be killed with no one held accountable unless you happen to record it and post it to Facebook like Joyce Echaquan did. Did not save her life, but it raised awareness of the problem. And also, you will die, on average, 5 to 10 years sooner than white Canadians. So we can believe it. We've got plenty of racism right here. Here are some examples of racism that happen regularly to people of color. They include everything from being followed in stores, maybe being asked for extra identification when trying to purchase things. It could be insensitive remarks by coworkers and even friends. Profiling by law enforcement. Could be things like, even extreme things like white nationalist rallies. And maybe there's not a white nationalist rally in your front yard, but if you turn on the news, you might happen to see one. Threats and racial slurs. We have over 20 years of research showing that racism leads to a number of negative mental health consequences, and so connections have been found between racism and all of these conditions. Some of these conditions, maybe people already have them and racism makes them worse. Some of these conditions can be caused by racism all by itself. And collectively, we may think of these problems as racial trauma. There are also a number of structural problems that propagate mental health problems among people of color. Here we have an example of a woman. She's trying to get mental health care. She says, I had to call 8 therapists just to get an appointment. I bet a white girl would have gotten it a lot quicker. You're the therapist. What do you say to her? Is she wrong? A lot of therapists might feel defensive, but she's actually not wrong if we look at the data. Here is a study that was done in New York City, a very diverse place, where they did a research study with people who were seeking therapy, all people in the same insurance plan, so finances weren't an issue, but they experimentally manipulated the gender of the caller, the race through accent and name cues, and the socioeconomic status through other cues as well. And what they found was that even among psychologists, there was racial bias against people of color. And so, for example, 28% of white people compared to 17% of black people received appointment offers. Offer rates for working class people who were both black and white were very low, only 8%. And the callers all requested an evening time. And among black working class males, they got the fewest offers for that coveted evening slot. So imagine you're working and you can't come to therapy during the day. Only 1.2 of them got an offer, as opposed to 20% of the white middle class women. So think about that for a minute. If you were a working class black man looking for a psychologist in New York City, you would have to call 80 therapists to find one who would be willing to see you after hours. And so I think most people would give up long before that, right? So these create barriers to help. And Maya Angelou says, prejudice is the burden that confuses the past, threatens the future, and renders the present inaccessible. And I think that this quote really helps us understand the problem of racism and how it can turn into racial trauma. So let's talk a little bit about trauma. What is trauma? How do we define it? So if we think about the DSM-5 criteria, this is an experience involving actual or threatened injury or death. Typically that involves intense fear, helplessness, or horror in reaction to the event. In the DSM-5, there were some additions made that you could potentially be traumatized by repeated exposure, like say on your job, to something that was very grisly. But when we think about psychological trauma, are there other things that can traumatize people? Think about what have you seen in your own practice. What about unexpected losses, right? Or bullying at school among kids, harassment or sexual harassment, leveraging power imbalances, racially motivated actions. So we've seen clients traumatized by all of these things, but none of them fit neatly into that limited definition of trauma. So when we think about racial traumas, in addition to thinking about things like assault, rape, and combat, people of color may have additional stressors, and certainly anybody could have these stressors too, but people of color tend to be overrepresented in having these kinds of stressors. And these include things like police harassment, search and assault, workplace discrimination, community violence, murder of loved ones, incarceration, and distressing medical or childbirth experiences. And refugees, asylees, parolees, immigrants may have additional traumas if they left under difficult circumstances. And these can include things like experiencing or witnessing torture. And our research actually showed that witnessing torture was actually more traumatic than experiencing it. Ethnic cleansing and persecution, destruction of cultural practices, living in a war zone, immigration difficulties, and deportation. These can all be very traumatic. Additionally, there's a long history of law enforcement being used as a tool of violence against people of color. And so the trauma of police violence can't be overlooked. Historical events figure prominently into problematic behaviors by law enforcement and communities of color in Canada, particularly Indigenous communities and Black communities. Indeed, the development of the police force in Canada was in large part informed by things like the institution of slavery and the desire to control Indigenous populations, which were accomplished in the form of slave patrols, night watches, and the Northwest Mounted Police, now the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. So within the Black and Indigenous community in Canada, there's a strong cultural memory of abuses by police and the state that extends from slave patrols to residential schools, to the 60s scoop, to the destruction of Africville, and into modern times as abuses and inequities are becoming more exposed in the public. And so considering all the harms done, it's no wonder that many people of color feel fear and distress around law enforcement who continue to perpetrate a whole system of injustice. Now, any history of previous exposure to a traumatic event increases one's risk of getting PTSD in the future from a new trauma. And so one of the things that we know is that multiple previous events will have a stronger impact than a single previous event, which is consistent with what we might call a sensitization hypothesis. And so the more trauma that you have, the more likely you'll be traumatized. Most people experiencing trauma for the first time actually do not get PTSD. Whereas people who have multiple traumas often do. Traumatization is also passed down generationally through both social and epigenetic or biological mechanisms. And historical and cultural traumas contribute to the prevalence of PTSD, which is one reason many ethnic communities may have higher rates of PTSD. Now, as a field, how prepared are therapists to treat racial trauma? What factors do therapists identify that contribute to racial trauma? To what extent do therapists address issues of racial trauma in their sessions? To what extent have therapists received training to identify racial trauma or training to treat racial trauma? Well, there was an interesting study done with 106 counselors where the researchers investigated their experiences with identifying and treating race-based trauma and the relationship between the training they received and treatment. And for the most part, most of the counselors were able to identify things that were traumatizing that had caused racial trauma in their clients. And they're pretty much the same things that I mentioned already. In fact, 71% reported that they had worked with clients who had experiences with race-based trauma. But 2/3 had not received any training in how to identify it. And over 80% had not received any training in how to treat it. So this highlights the disparities between the health care that people may need and the provision of those services. So racism in all of its forms will eventually take a toll, even microaggressions, which may be considered minor or subtle. So for those of you who may be unfamiliar with the term, racial microaggressions are small racist acts that are not clearly racially motivated. They occur frequently in everyday situations, and they create uncertainty and anxiety in people on the receiving end who may be trying to figure out why did that person do that and what did they mean. So microaggressions can be defined as deniable acts of racism. And one way you can identify them is because they reinforce pathological or false stereotypes about people groups. They reinforce inequitable social norms and power differentials, and or they communicate exclusion. And so microaggressions have been assumed to be unintentional acts of unconscious bias. Actually, the research does not support that. Rather, microaggressions are strongly correlated to aggression in anyone who does microaggressions. And in fact, this doesn't mean that, for example, everyone who commits a microaggression is aggressive, but it does mean that people who commit more microaggressions are more aggressive. Here are some examples of microaggressions. This is based on the work of Sue in identifying different microaggressions categories, which then our research lab did some additional studies and found these categories were mostly the same. But here are, and I'm not going to read all of these, but here are the different categories of microaggressions along with an example of the microaggression. Now, microaggressions are context dependent, so maybe you could think of a situation where someone might say one of these things and it's not a microaggression. I tried to pick things that were like almost always microaggressions, but maybe you could come up with something. And then here's a few more examples of microaggressions, and I should point out that these are not always things people say. They're not always things people do. They can be environmental. So somebody could have put a microaggression in the environment a long time ago, and it's just still there perpetrating hate because somebody thought it was a good idea at the time and maybe wanted to make their own covert statement. So microaggressions can be actions, and they can be in the environment. So what is the function of a microaggression? We know that microaggressions have been going on since they were defined back in the late 60s by Dr. Chester Pierce. People of color have never liked microaggressions, and yet they continue to happen. So as good scientists, we have to ask ourselves, how have they been maintained? What is this mechanism? Here we have these common, ambiguous, subtle, innocent, unintentional acts that produce stress and anxiety and can even be traumatizing. In fact, these are socially learned, unspoken means of establishing or reestablishing dominance. So that is how they work, and that's why people keep doing them. If you think about this example, oh, is your hair real? Can I touch it? Often people might say this as they're reaching to touch your hair. How is it okay to touch another person, particularly their hair or their head? That's a very intimate act, right? Maybe you touch a child's head or someone that's your significant other, but you don't just touch other people unless you own them, right? So what does that communicate? Think about that. Microaggressions can also impact clinical care. So these categories are socially constructed but still have real consequences for those who are racialized. And this may be doubly true for people with multiple marginalized identities. They contribute to mental health disparities. They create a barrier to care because people go in to get health care and they experience microaggressions from their clinicians and they don't want to come back, right? Or they may not want to adhere to treatment recommendations, or you lose rapport with the client because of microaggressions. And so all of this contributes to mental health disparities. So for people of color, they often feel like they're in a catch-22 when they experience microaggressions because anything they do feels like the wrong thing. So they often decide to do nothing or sit on their feelings or their anger, which we know is psychologically not healthy, because maybe they're unsure if it was really a microaggression or they're at a loss for how to respond. They're fearful of the consequences because of a racial power imbalance. They rationalize, oh, it won't do any good anyway. Or they engage in self-deception through denial, maybe like it didn't happen. Or they think that like maybe it's going on at work and they figure they're going to be dismissed or ignored if they communicate problems. But responding with anger and striking back, which may be like a normal reaction, is likely to engender negative consequences, negative social consequences, or worse. And also telling others about their experiences can result in negative social consequences as well, such as rejection or blame when people express doubt about their experience. So this is how racism causes trauma. These racist incidents need to be understood as traumatic. They affect survivors in ways that are analogous to the effect that rape and domestic violence have on their victims, because the act is a violation of an individual's personhood. The person feels disempowered or powerless. The events are unpredictable and uncontrollable, which is a recipe for anxiety. And then when someone tries to call attention to it, well, then they may be challenged, ridiculed, or dismissed by others. And so the recurring violence of microaggressions can be thought of as similar to bullying or sexual harassment. And in fact, research shows that subtle acts can be as bad as overt acts. And in addition, many acts of racism actually do meet DSM-5 criteria for traumatic experiences. Anytime that someone makes an overt racial slur or threat, that can be very frightening. Police harassment, body search, and assault, that can feel like a sexual violation. Workplace discrimination, coworkers can express threats through, for example, this is an example of things that have happened, putting pictures of a noose on someone's desk, right? That's like a threat. Community violence, where people are afraid for their life. Fear that doctors aren't going to help you or your loved one, or that your child might die because the doctor's not giving him proper attention. Immigration difficulties. Victims often experience physical or sexual assault or robbery during the immigration process. And in deportation can be traumatic. For example, if children witness violent confrontations and abduction of their parents by law enforcement, right? So these things can all also be criterion A traumas. And as I pointed out, but even microaggressions can be traumatizing. And research shows that everyday discrimination in general, major discrimination over the lifetime, and general ethnic discrimination over the lifetime, all are equally traumatizing. And it's not that there's anything wrong with people who experience microaggressions. In fact, one researcher theorized that maybe people complaining of microaggressions were just neurotic, but in fact, if we look at the data, actually Black people are less neurotic, and so then it doesn't really make sense that they're having more microaggressions, right? So it's not a sign of neuroticism or any other personality issue to want microaggressions to stop. That's actually like a healthy, good thing. So given what I explained about how trauma is cumulative, if you come from a culture that already has historical trauma or a cultural trauma, you already have a layer of stress and vulnerability. And then on top of that, you add microaggressions or everyday racism, then you're already stressed even more. And so then you can have a traumatic event, could be a small event, could be a large event, that pushes a person over from being stressed to being traumatized. They may try to talk to other people about what happened or try to get some help or justice and be invalidated. And they may try to get mental health care and encounter barriers to care due to structural racism, right? Maybe there's no clinicians in their communities or who speak their language, or they can't afford the person, or there's nobody who's been trained in racial trauma. So in addition, there are a number of issues having to do with even just assessing racial trauma. Existing measures for PTSD aimed at identifying an index trauma typically don't include racism on their list of options. So where do you squeeze that in? People of color may be reluctant to volunteer experiences of racism to white clinicians who comprise the majority of mental health care providers. Clients may worry that the clinicians won't understand or will become defensive, like maybe so many other people in their lives have been. And people may not link their symptoms of PTSD to their experiences of discrimination, particularly if asked about a single index event. So we need new tools to assess racial trauma. Fortunately, I have developed some new tools. So we have an interview now. It's called the Yukon Racial Ethnic Stress and Trauma Survey, or the UNREST. And it's basically a guided interview, tells people step by step what to actually say and ask to elicit information about the person's trauma, because I found one of the biggest problems was that clinicians felt very uncertain of what to say, how to start the conversation, and how to ask the questions. So I just wrote it all down, say, okay, just say this. And that's how we came up with the interview. And then we validated it. Also, our lab has been working on a number of self-report measures for racial trauma. We have the Trauma Symptoms of Discrimination Scale. It came out in 2018, and that's available in English and Spanish and now French. We also just published a racial trauma scale. See, it's still in press. And that is a measure for clinicians to use where they can just have your clients fill it out, and then you can go over it with them and say, hey, look, I noticed you checked off you're having lots of nightmares about racism. Let's talk about it. We have a short form for research. And then also the race-based traumatic stress and symptom scale, which was developed by Carter, is also available. It's been around a while. It's a little tricky, honestly, to score. It's kind of hard to score, and it's very long, but there is a short form. And also our team developed a Spanish version that's now being piloted. Another important consideration is racial and ethnic identity development, which is a process. It's a challenging process for everyone. People may start at a stage where they don't think much about their race and ethnicity, and over time decide what that means to them. We know that this can also be protective against racism unless the acts of racism are severe. And it's important to understand what is whiteness, right? So most white people don't think about their own whiteness, and they don't define themselves based on their skin color, and so they experience themselves as non-racialized. And they also don't see how their whiteness has given them power and privilege compared to people who aren't white, especially if their own experience in their lives has been one of hard work and struggle. And that can make developing a positive pro-social white identity very challenging. And so I want to just quickly finish up by talking about how you can support people of color who've already experienced discrimination, be it in a professional setting or healthcare settings, and even clinicians, we experience this too. The most important thing is that people need to feel heard and believed in the face of challenging experiences. Everybody has their own way of trying to cope with racism. Some of those ways are helpful and functional, some are not. So as a clinician, you want to assess and find out how your clients are coping with racism, denial, substance use, aggression, self-blame, self-harm, suicidal ideation. These are all, harmful ways of dealing with racism. And that's why it's so important to assess for these, because as a clinician, you want to help people replace these with more functional ways of coping. But we have to do more than just cope. So when someone talks about their experiences of oppression, any kind of oppression, but especially racism, you want to avoid automatically looking for alternative explanations. People who experience racism need to feel believed and validated and heard, because half of the power of racism is really just making people question themselves, making people feel like what's happening to them isn't happening, and then they have no way to explain what they're going through. As a person of color who was there for the experience of racism, they need to be recognized as the authority on their experience. And so if you're a CBT therapist, I'm a CBT therapist. If you're a CBT therapist, don't do Socratic questioning as to whether or not this was really a racial event. If you're a psychodynamic therapist, don't try to interpret their experience, okay? Your number one job at the front end is to validate. And then to help people cope, you want to place the blame where it belongs, right? On the perpetrator. And secondarily, our cultural dysfunction. It's not the person's fault that they experienced racism. Encourage social support within one's community, close friends, family, people who get it. Clients should limit exposure to cues of racism as needed while they're recovering. So maybe signing off social media or avoiding places where lots of racism happens for a while. They may use religious or spiritual practices for comfort, prayer, or if they're not religious, meditation. Engage in enjoyable activities, self-care, rest, relaxation. As they get more healing, they may engage in peaceful activism, making meaning from their pain, educating others, and be patient, because that's a process. There haven't been any empirically supported treatment approaches for racial trauma. our lab's been working on this. We published a paper 2014 on adapting prolonged exposure for racial trauma. We also developed a protocol for veterans of color, which is now going on at many different VA hospitals in the States. And now we just came out what we call the Healing Racial Trauma Protocol. And you can actually get that now. It's a 12-step protocol that's grounded in the research and the science about how to help people of color. And we'll have handouts with details for those of you who are interested. Some resources that I recommend are, well, this book that I'm a co-editor on, Eliminating Race-Based Mental Health Disparities, which is from a contextual behavioral science perspective. Managing Microaggressions, so everything you need to know about microaggressions as a clinician, it's right there. And then we have this resource, which is homegrown right here in Ontario, by my colleague, Dr. Jude Marie Snott. It's called Mental Health for Everyone. It's anti-racism training for mental health professionals. And for people who want to work on just getting better at having the conversations, I started this Anti-Racism International Meetup group, and everybody's welcome to join. We have different topics every month. This is a training that I gave on the 12-session protocol that just is published now, and this is available, like you can watch it through PESI, and you can even get CEs for it. And then recently I started I was part of a plant medicine retreat back in July, and it was so successful. We're having some more, and this is one, for example, just for Black women, where Black women can kind of come together in sanctuary and get some healing together. So those are some of the things we're working on, and I'll stop there and say thank you all for coming. And thank you, and there's my contact information, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.